Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another episode of CryptoBind Digital Insights powered by JISA Softech. I am Gaurav Soni, and I will be your moderator for today's session. So today we are discussing a topic that has become extremely important for every organization, irrespective of the industry or size, which is data discovery and classification from complexity to intelligence. And to help us unpack this topic, I am joined by two subject matter experts. So I have with me Mr. Ashish Dhar, who is a data security and privacy consultant and advisor, and my colleague Harsh Rane. So thank you both of you for joining us today. So now, before we jump into the discussion, let me start with a simple question to our audience. So imagine your organization has thousands of files spread across laptops, servers, cloud storage, SharePoints, emails, databases, and collaboration tools. So how many of those files contain sensitive information? How many of them contains customer data or employee records? And more importantly, do you actually know where the data is sitting today? And the reality is that most organizations don't. For years, these companies focused on protecting their networks, applications, or endpoints. But today, regulations like Digital Personal Data Protection, which is DPDP, are forcing organizations to focus on something more important, and that is the data itself. Because before you can protect your data or govern your data or comply with regulations, you first need to know what data you have, where is it stored, who has access to it, whether it should be retained or deleted, and whether you have the consent to keep processing it. So in fact, one of the biggest challenges organization is facing today is that the timeline for DPDPA compliance is getting shorter, while the amount of data they manage continues to grow exponentially. So this is exactly where data discovery and classification becomes the foundation of any successful privacy, security, or compliance program. So to help us understand this better, I would like to bring our first expert speaker for the day, Mr. Ashish Dhar. So Ashish, my first question is to you. You there, Ashish?
Yeah, I'm there.
Yeah, hi. So how crucial is data discovery and classification, especially from a DPDPA perspective? And perhaps you could also help our audience understand why organizations should start focusing on this from today rather than waiting for regulations to catch up with them. So over to you, Ashish.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Gaurav, for having invited me for this very important topic related to DPDP implementation. And thanks to JISA for organizing the series of webinars. I think this is the 10th of the series. I was also part of one of the first webinar where immediately after the DPDP rules got announced on November 13th. We had our first webinar on trying to understand the overall DPDP legislation and the associated rules and regulations. So as you rightly said, I mean, time is running out because government has given a mandate for getting a phase-wise implementation. The first phase is coming live in a couple of months in July, where the consent management framework should go live. And very shortly after that, within another year, we will have the full gamut of DPDP rules and regulations coming into force, which means that we just have about more than a year for organizations to understand how to go ahead in compliance with the DPDP. But I think before we go into the technical thing, overall, what has happened is this is a very positive legislation that the government has brought in because this is the first time where even our courts, Supreme Court has recognized data privacy as a fundamental right. And with that right comes a lot of responsibilities uh, to us as individual who are called data principal, people who using some kind of business services and sharing their data. And the business also, who are called data fiduciary, who are responsible for processing the data with due care and due responsibility and accountability. So it brings a lot of responsibility and accountability both on the data principal, the customer or the consumer of business services, and also the data fiduciary, which is the business. Now, what happens is the first step that most people have already understood is that with the consent management framework coming live in July, all organizations, wherever they are offering any kind of services to their end customers, would now need to provide a consent to which the customer or the data principal has to give his or her agreement or consent. And along with that, there should be a notice. The notice will tell the customer and inform him how his or her data, personal data that the business is going to collect, would be processed, who will access it, how will it be accessed, uh, till how long it will be utilized. And there are very definite and very clear guidelines in the rules and regulations. So what happens now is across the customer life cycle, from the time I, as a customer, get onboarded to any business, to any of the utilities that we have, be it our normal utilities like telephony, electricity, gas utilities, whatever we use in our personal lives, and whatever we use in official capacity or in a e-commerce website, right? Anywhere, wherever we are offering, getting some services consumed, we will have to be presented with a consent form and a notice. Therein, the business has to provide all the personal data elements that they are capturing. So it becomes very important from that point onward that the organizations, whenever they get an agreement and a consent of a particular data element, how will they process it is becoming their responsibility. It is no more a data principal responsibility, because data principal, after having given the consent, is also have to be assured that those the kind of guidelines are being met. So the entire customer life cycle, there will be multiple different types of data will get accessed, stored, and retained. So across the life cycle, there has to be a proper mechanism to store the data while it is in rest, while the data is moving from one business application to the other, from one stakeholder to the other stakeholder in the data value processing chain, how it is being accessed, and what kind of controls are implemented. And now with this data, whenever it is being between accessed by multiple stakeholders, comes the another aspect called data principal rights management. Because as a data principal, I would have a full and complete view at any point of time how and where my data, personal data, is being consumed and processed. That's one of the key mandate of the DPDP, which gives a right to me as a data principal to anytime ask my business, show me where my personal data is, show me how can I update and keep that up to date. And if I don't want to be associated with you, I even want my data to be deleted. Now, this is a very simple statement or a simple ask, but this is a very fundamental, this poses a very fundamental technical challenge to the business, because this is a paradigm change. And there are the government with this legislation of DPDP have implemented some fundamental privacy principles. There are 7 privacy principles. I'm sure we have covered that in our past webinars. So all
Yeah.
of those privacy principles comes into force, and there are technical implications of implementing all those privacy principles as part of that. So consent is just one part. Next comes how the data flows into your downstream applications. So all of your downstream applications, which is consuming and processing the data along with the stakeholders who are operationalizing those applications must be kept aware of this responsibility accountability. So herein, data discovery and classification comes in a big way because it is simply not possible because we are in the digital age, we are handling a huge volume of data which is very volatile and it is moving very fast across applications,
Right.
across our digital stack. So it it needs some kind of an automated solution wherein businesses can deploy that solution to figure out for which customer what of his personal data and sensitive data is present in which of my data inventory and data assets, which are the applications which are processing the data, and which are the stakeholders, and whether they have the right credentials, the right authorization to process the data, right? So with that comes another
Right.
aspect where we call something called risk, how the risk of data not being misused. And Gaurav, you might be aware, and we all of our audience are aware that most of the scams that is
Yeah.
happening all around us, the frauds, are because that someone has got unauthorizedly some of your personal data through which they are
Yes.
staging some attack through creating some fake identities and then kind of confusing people to share those information, and then their banking and financial frauds are happening. So the businesses who have to
Yes.
implement DPDP would have to implement data discovery and classification to understand in the entire data life cycle, in their entire data landscape, where and how this customer personal data is being processed, and if they are also outsourced part of their business, or if they have subcontracted part of their operations to other partners or vendors, then they also have to very clearly handshake this responsibility with their third party vendors, that the data that they are passing on for further
Yes.
downstream processing must also be very sensitively handled, so that none of the provisions of DPDP is being defeated.
Yeah.
So I think breach response readiness and management is part of that. Data governance is part of that mandate. And the most and the key thing is it is not only one or two stakeholders, it is the entire organization. The entire business organization, all of
Right.
his employees must be themselves taking responsibility and accountability for mandating this privacy implementation. So employee awareness and training is one of the most critical need of the hour. So data discovery and classification is just one part of the solution. We will possibly maybe in the webinar talk through all other aspects. So, but I think hopefully this answers in short, Gaurav, that you
Yes,
are looking.
of course, Ashish. And with this, I have another question for you that how does data discovery and classification complement consent management? So if you can just throw some light on this particular thing.
Yeah, so if we can move to the next slide, that
Yeah.
tells us how are we going to utilize data discovery along with consent management, because consent
Yes.
management is just one aspect of taking control, I mean taking agreement of what data we are capturing and getting sign off from our customer. But then
Yes.
the law has given lot of power and lot of checks and balances for the customer to validate at any point of time how and where and with which processes my personal data is being utilized. So
Right.
for a business organization, data discovery and classification is a foundational piece, because without that, it is like you are navigating and having a journey without having a GPS along with you. Because if you have
Right.
started from a source and you don't know how to reach the
Don't know where
destination,
to.
obviously you will be lost. So data
True.
discovery helps you with discovering all aspects of how the data is being captured and processed and where it is moving in the entire customer life cycle and the data journey, right? So it
Yes.
provides you a compass, a very focused tactics aligned with your business strategy to understand whether you are complying with this the DPDP Act. At the same time, I was mentioning about seven privacy principles, which is the foundational piece of this legislation. And I think there are many very good legislations around the world. GDPR is one of them. So
Yes.
some of the key concepts of GDPR, not exactly the same way, because ours is much more evolved than GDPR. So one of the central piece of this privacy principle is called purpose limitation, which means that we must not collect more data than it is required. Uh, what we see right
Right.
now in the environment is we go for any particular kind of buying one particular kind of service, and the business will ask you a bunch of POI and POA documents. आप
Bunch of
आधार भी दे
questions.
दो,
Yeah.
आप
Information which
इलेक्ट्रिसिटी
is
बिल
even
दे
not
दो, आप
required.
पैन दे दो, आप सब कुछ दे दो. And
Exactly.
there is no kind of a control of what happens when you share those data. So this legislation, first of all, brings in gives everyone a clear reminder that only you have to collect that data that is absolutely necessary for the purpose of providing you the service. So if your service does not need anything to be provided for your proof of address, then you need not, right, provide that. So the the consumer or the
Yes.
customer
Very
has
true.
to be made aware,
Very true.
and at the same time the business has to be made aware, because the more data you collect, it becomes an additional cost for the business to store that, to manage
Manage
it
that.
across the
Store
life
that,
cycle.
manage that. Yeah.
Yes, to utilize all kinds of controls with respect to data encryption, data backups, right? So at the end, your operational cost goes high. So data discovery and classification will help you make the business aware whether they are actually limiting the collection of data, and this purpose limitation is one key
Very
aspect which
true.
can be enforced. The next part is obviously, as I
Yes.
said, consent is just a legal agreement. At the end, how you are operationalizing DPDP journey can only be possible if you are implementing data discovery and classification, because it is the central piece of operationalizing DPDP. And being a technical solution, an automated solution, it will be very seamless, whoever is implementing that. Next comes obviously the
Great.
data
Very good.
principal rights management, right? So as I mentioned, the data principal, which is the customer, is given lot of power and
Hmm.
authority to understand how their data is being processed. So with this discovery and classification, we will be able to understand, the business will be able to understand for which customer, uh, where is his or her personal data residing, in which data store, whether there are enough controls implemented with respect to the privacy enhancing techniques, which we are experts. JISA is an expert in that technology. So there are multiple PETs that we provide to safeguard, and DPDP talks about security safeguards in a big way. So at any point of time, if I have to come and ask business, I want to access my data or update it, or ensure it is deleted, business will be at loss if they don't have a discovery and classification solution, because once the data gets captured, it is consumed in the CRM, it then passed to the marketing, Salesforce, ERP, business analytics, GenAI. It
Hmm.
passes through multiple layers of the application, right? So there are multiple
Right.
copies of the data residing in different data stores. As you rightly said in the starting line, the data landscape is very diverse. So
Hmm.
it is very difficult to manage all of that. So if you don't know where and how your data is deciding if there is a breach that gets reported from your organization, you will be clueless to figure out, first of all, who who are my customers whose data has got leaked or breached, and which are those systems which I have to immediately go ahead and protect, and which are the
Yeah.
stakeholders whose access controls I have to disable, right? So
Yeah.
discovery
Very
and
true.
classification solution helps us with all of that, along with I talked about the third party risk management, because whenever I'm sharing as part of my business operations with a third party vendor, I have to have also
Yeah.
the concept of data lineage implemented along with data discovery and classification, because data lineage will give me the answer who, where, and how my personal data or the data principal's personal data is being processed. So overall, I think that's the key
Okay.
aspects of using data discovery with consent management properly.
So thank you, Ashish. Thank you so much, Ashish. So since you have brought that topic of data lineage, my next question is to Harsh on the same topic. So, Harsh, data lineage helps organization understand where the data comes from and where it flows. But how important is it to also map the business processes, business functions, and the business outcome to this? Harsh, over to you.
Yes, so I hope I'm audible, and thank you
Yeah.
for having me as a part of this webinar. So, as you rightly said, it is actually a very important point because data lineage by itself, it I think only tells the technical part of the story. It shows where the data originated, it shows what systems it has moved through, or where the copies have been created and who has accessed it. But for privacy and compliance at large, it's only a part of the picture. So organizations, I think, they need to understand which business processes the data supports, which department owns that particular process, and ultimately which business outcome is being achieved. So this is where the business process mapping against the data lineage becomes extremely critical. So just to give you an example, if there is a customer data flowing from a loan application system into a data warehouse, and then maybe it was going into a marketing platform, the lineage can show me how or where this flow exists, but it cannot tell me whether that flow is aligned with the original purpose for which that data was collected. So to answer that, I need the business context in place, right? That why this data is being processed or who approved of it and why the business function owns it. So this becomes especially important for DPIA or data protection impact assessments. Data protection impact assessment is fundamentally about understanding the privacy risks associated with the business process. And to perform a meaningful impact assessment, you need to know not only where this data travels, but also why it is being used, who was involved, and where which of these third parties that are there are receiving it, and what is the impact of a breach or misuse that could have on the individuals if at all that scenario comes up. So when data lineage is mapped to business processes, organizations, I think, can clearly identify the high risk processing activities. They understand the downstream dependencies and the third party access exposure and those kind of things. And this is all very crucial for data principal rights to assess any of the correction or erasure measures. So in simple terms, I think data lineage tells us how data moves, but business process mapping tells us why it moves. And bringing these together is very crucial to complete the picture for, say, governance or impact assessments and ultimately DPDP compliance as a whole.
So thank you, Harsh. My next question is to Ashish. So what are some of the critical problems that can occur if organizations do not perform data discovery before enforcing the security controls to protect their data? Can you just let us know what are your thoughts on that, Ashish?
Yeah, so first of all, there are two aspects. We are talking about privacy, but privacy need to also exist along with security. Okay. So now data security is policy driven, right? Any of organizations who have to implement any cybersecurity, the data security comes a part of that. Now, so why we have to secure data? Because these are our crown jewels, right? If as a business I somehow lose my core financial data, my core IP, intellectual property, I lose my customer data, it is a big impact to my trust, my reputation in the market, right? So obviously I have to secure the data. But now with the DPDP, it is now taken up the value chain because data security is more about keeping your house, your business secure from different kinds of
Secure.
internal and external threats and risks,
That's
right? But here in
yeah,
DPDP, with
right.
the data privacy coming in, you are also made responsible for the fundamental right of your business customers, right? So where are those fundamental rights enforced? Because if the customer is giving trust through the consent mechanism that I'm giving my data for this purpose, and if as a business I lose that data and someone, uh, which can be an internal actor, uh, somehow gets access, because in banking and insurance industry, which is one of the core domains where
Mhm.
JISA provides its solutions, customer
Yes.
onboarding is the first point where the lot of KYC documents are getting collected, right? And I mentioned about the POI, POA, and those documents, right? So what happens is when the organization starts through its multiple operational channels, through the web, through the physical stores, the retail channel, the wholesale channel, there are multiple stakeholders where the data is being collected, right? And then they are possibly kept into some centralized storage, either in the cloud or on the on-premise. So in that landscape, you
International. Yeah.
have different endpoints, different data storage elements, like you have different types of data stores, SharePoint, Teams, Microsoft OneDrive, cloud storage. So, and you also have to ensure that when those data is getting stored there, there is a proper security controls. Now, the security
Yes.
controls cannot be just implemented only once because your business is evolving. There are
The data is
organization
continuously coming from the business.
data companies coming. You are onboarding not only new customers, new partners, new vendors. Your business is expanding. You might be acquiring other companies. You might be moving to a
Right.
different business line. So your application landscape is evolving. Your business processes are evolving,
Right.
which has to be keep up to date with the
Yeah.
security controls and policies on the data store. Now, what happens is this data discovery and classification, with its ability to scan in a real time through incremental scans or full scans or different level of very sophisticated scanning mechanism, it can identify where the which of the data stores is highly risky from a perspective of whether the data that is lying there has a huge concentration of sensitive data. It could be my IP data or my financial data of my business or my customers. And if there are people who in my ecosystem have got some overprivileged access, say someone has got a delete access
Mhm.
where they should only have read access. Someone has got a full admin
Right.
access where they should only have a analyst level access. So what we do in the data discovery and classification is not only we scan for the sensitivity of the data present there, we also scan for whether the data is protected through behind a firewall, behind some rule-based access controls, behind and using some PE
Okay.
keys. So we uncover the situation of the data, what is its current state, and how vulnerable it is, and report that, right? So just to ensure
Okay.
that the data is not being processed by some unauthorized stakeholder or actor, which can create a risk scenario of a data breach or a data leak. Now, data leak is normally coming from inside my system. It is intentional, and data breach is someone from outside my business hacking into my system
It's trying
uh,
to attack it.
and with a very strategic view to get hold of my
Yeah.
business and customer data, and then maybe use
Yes.
that for creating different kind of frauds like identity frauds or digital frauds, and this is what we have to prevent, right? So these are some of the key problems where data discovery and classification comes in and tells you,
Mhm.
the business, uh, where are those gaps exist, right? So I
Right.
think Harsh talked about DPIA. So DPIA is one process through which we do a one-time check. But data discovery and classification is your guard, which is working 24 cross 365, automated made, and it is the
Mhm.
CCTV camera, I would say, which is watching how your data is
Yeah.
moving out, right? So in CCTV camera, we watch how material and people are moving around, but data discovery and classification is the CCTV camera for watching how my data is being moved around my business ecosystem.
Yes. Okay. Okay. So,
I hope that
yeah,
explains it.
that was really nice. So my next question will again to you, Ashish. So how does a tool like Optify DDC, or which is data discovery and classification, creates actionable business intelligence from the data it processes?
Correct. So if you can move to the next slide, we have just given a very two simple snapshots. I don't know how much visible it is in the PPT that has
Yes,
been
Bilkul,
shared.
yes, we can see it today.
Yeah. So there, as I said, there are data discovery and classification that we deploy in Optify uh, has a very intelligent way of figuring out uh, the the nature of the data, the how sensitive the data is, because whether you are using Aadhaar, PAN, a credit card, date of birth, or even simple documents which are in the image format, there are a lot of sensitivity associated with it, right? So
Yeah.
we basically use our Octify data discovery and classification solution to understand how sensitive the data is, and maybe we will try to explain it in the next slides, how we calculate that. So first of all, we calculate the risk behind the data stores. If the data stores are not properly configured, if they are misconfigured, if they are not hardened the admin credentials,
Proper
anyone can
admin.
possibly break into the data store and get access to the personal data. Then we also need to figure out whether the database is properly backed up. Is it behind a firewall? Okay. Is the database encrypted? So we first look at the actual data store,
Yes.
how well it is configured, how well it is secure. Then we go deep inside the data store, and then we figure out by scanning. For a structured database, we scan the different tables, views, rows, and columns. And from there, we summarize how and where the sensitive data is residing. Similarly, we also scan the different unstructured or semi-structured data, which is lying in the form of a PDF or email or some file storage system like NAS device or a Teams, where people have a lot of data. So we will scan all those file systems and file stores in a same
Mhm.
way DLP solution scans. But what we
Okay.
do is we bring in more intelligent analytics from those scanning, which will tell me not only how sensitive the data is, whether the database itself is not properly secured, and who are the users who are accessing the data stores and what kind of actions they are performing, and whether that action can create some risk of a data exfiltration. So we also do behavioral analytics. So there are
Mhm.
very different threat scenarios which we have built into our model, right? There is a framework called Lindun framework through which we are able to figure out runtime, real time, if a person is at a very odd hour downloading a huge volume of data from a data store which is marked as a very sensitive data store, then we can immediately create an alert and notification. So this dashboard that you see is basically a holistic 360-degree view of your entire data landscape, how secure your data landscape is, who are the stakeholders, what are the different risks scenarios which are happening around that, and what is the overall volume and spread of that risk across your landscape. So it
Okay.
gives you a complete bird's eye view to the top level CXOs and also the different business heads and vertical owners to understand how secure their particular department or function is with respect to the different business processes and data that they own. And through this view, they can then get understanding of the different risk analytics. And we have a very flexible and very flexible and very versatile policy engine, which will then act on this risk analytics and then remediate those risks by either removing access of the threat actors or encrypting or implementing PET so the data gets anonymized, encrypted, or masked, or even stop full access to the data stored and take it offline in case if there is a breach which we have got reported. So at the end, there is a lot of contextual business intelligence and associated data processing risk from a privacy perspective is summarized with actionable insight in the form of a policy engine to remediate those risks.
Okay. Okay. So thank you, Ashish. Now the next question is to Harsh. So Harsh, why has data discovery and classification become a foundational requirement for a successful AI adoption?
So I think one of the biggest misconceptions currently is that around Gen AI specifically is that organizations they believe that the challenge is selecting the right AI model, whereas in reality, the success of any Gen AI initiative or any implementation depends far more on the quality, the visibility, and the security also of the data that is being fed into that model.
Right.
So
Right.
that is why data discovery and classification has become, say, a foundational requirement of any Gen AI adoption. So before any organization can safely use Gen AI, it needs to first understand what data
Okay.
it has, where the data resides, who owns it, and how sensitive it is. If you don't have that visibility, then the risk of exposing personal data or confidential business information, it becomes a regulatory challenge for AI systems. And data
Yeah.
discovery and classification, it also plays a key role in data governance. So one aspect, of course, is data quality. That is, Gen AI models, as we know, they're only as good as the data that they consume or the data that they're trained on. So any DDC tool will help identify the duplicate, obsolete, or any inaccurate records or any data that has been poorly governed so that organizations they can improve the quality of their training data set and hence the overall model performance as a prerequisite as can be enhanced. So the second aspect, of course, to this is data security. Once any sensitive data that has been identified and classified, the organizations can then apply the appropriate, say, PETs, or privacy enhancing technologies, such as your encryption or tokenization or masking within the AI pipeline or, whenever data is stored at rest. So various solutions can then be selected according to where the data is residing or how it is being used in the pipelines. And then this also ensures that sensitive information, it remains protected even when it is being accessed by AI applications or shared across any environments. So I think before asking how do we deploy Gen AI, organizations should first ask, do we know what data we have, how trustworthy it is, and how well it is
Yes.
protected? So DDC tool provides this foundation and it enables the organizations to build successful GenAI initiatives that are not only effective, but also secure and compliant and correctly governed.
Okay. So the next question I would actually ask you and actually both to help me out to understand this thing, that why organization often struggle with both shadow data and inaccurate data classification, and how does this Optify DDC address these challenges to provide a reliable visibility into sensitive data across the enterprise?
So shadow data is, yes, it is one of the biggest challenges organizations face today, because a large part of this sensitive data, it often exists outside the officially managed systems. It could be sitting in some shared folder or in any employee's individual laptops, any archived repositories or any collaborative platforms. So the problem is that security and compliance teams can only protect what they know or what that exists. If sensitive data is hidden in these unmanaged or say poorly governed or inaccessible locations, then it creates a lot of blind spots that increase the risk of data breaches. And as a, subsequently it calls for compliance violations as well. So this is where I think Optify DDC really helps, rather than relying solely on the asset inventories or predefined repositories. It performs very broad discovery that is across structured, semi-structured, and unstructured data sources to identify where the sensitive data is actually residing. And by continuously scanning the enterprise environment, organizations can, I think, uncover previously unknown data stores or any other duplicate copies of sensitive information, and that data that has been moved beyond the business process, beyond the required perimeters. So once this visibility has been established, I think organizations can gain a much more accurate understanding of their data landscape. It allows them to prioritize their remediation efforts and subsequently also enforce the governance policies and reduce the overall attack, that is the attack surface rather, that is associated with the shadow data. So of course, discovery is only the first step, but the next challenge is ensuring that this data is obviously classified correctly or accurately. This is where minimizing the false positives, as you said, becomes extremely important. And visibility is only valuable if the classification then can be trusted. So, Ashish sir, you can take up the part of how the
Yeah.
tool is reducing false
Yes.
positives.
So I think this is a very important piece that Harsh you mentioned, and I think have been highlighted by Gaurav, that false positives, right? So so we talked about discovery a lot. Now, what happens to the classification? So when we actually scan the data, we have to build some intelligence in our scanning tool so that it, whenever it encounters some data, it understands what is it all about. Is it PII data as a personal identifier information? Is it data related to some financial information as in PCI standards? Or it is related to PHI, which is health related information? Or it can also be a non-human identity information, NHI, right? Secrets and the keys as well. So, and in the agentic AI space, the NHI is as critical as a normal human identity, right? So, when our scanning tools encounters the data, it basically have to do a multi-factor analysis. It is not just based on pattern matching through a regex, but where we what we use is we use a combination of different techniques. First thing is obviously using some key algorithm like Varov's algorithm for Aadhaar, Loon's algorithm for credit card number. So these are very standard industry standard algorithms where we also validate the checksum of the data that we are reading, and then we classify it either as a credit card data or other data if the algorithm gives us a true result. But if it is not as simple as a credit card or Aadhaar, there could be even a 10-digit number which can be looking like a PAN number. and a PAN number can also be look like a passport number. So there are multiple alphanumeric numbers and patterns that we encounter. So it is
Yes.
difficult then. And then I have seen even when we started developing, we used to get a lot of those false positives that maybe a telephone number is not getting recognized, but it is classified as a normal ID, or a PAN ID is getting classified as a passport number. So similar false
Practical
positives are
problems.
very,
Yeah.
very normal, because in any business landscape, there are not very well-defined data catalogs or data dictionary, right? Hardly you will see a business will go to that level of defining a glossary and a catalog of what kind of data they have. So when we do the scanning, we don't have the privilege to refer to that glossary or the data dictionary. So we have to build our own dictionary through which, and our own taxonomy. So through the different implementation and deployments we have done, we continuously enrich our own knowledge base. We enrich our AI and ML techniques, train our models, so that when we do this identification of what type of data that particular value is, we use these different techniques like dictionary and taxonomy matching, keyword matching, metadata analysis. When we say metadata analysis, we also look at different aspects. Okay, what is the column name say? What is the file name say? What is the file
Yeah.
storage name say? Right, and what kind of textual description that file name can convey as intelligence, right? And then we also use different kind of ML techniques with respect to context based analysis, with respect to proximity based analysis, with respect to domain based analysis. So what we actually end up is build a confidence score based on different levels of iterations of our data
Okay.
classification. The plain and vanilla is obviously pattern match, which hardly gives us more than 30% confidence. But then when we
Right.
take it to multiple iterations of different levels, for example, when we go to the next level of L2, we combine a pattern match with a keyword and dictionary match, which gives us a little bit better result and confidence score of 50%. When we take it and then process along with the metadata that I mentioned, the data that we understand from the data store or the file name, it gives us some more clues. So that takes our confidence a little bit higher. But our highest level of confidence comes when we combine all of these classical ways of data classification along with the NLP based ML techniques, where we understand the business context. Because when we look into the data, our models would be able to understand whether it is coming from a banking customer, from an insurance customer, or an e-commerce customer, or a healthcare customer, right? Because ID for a patient ID and a normal employee ID would have different context, right? It is a
Yes.
simple
Yes.
ID to alphanumeric number, but we can understand whether that ID is not just employee ID, but a patient ID. And there are some PHI or health records associated with it, which is very sensitive, right? So
Yes.
these are the different, even for example, a date. Now, if you have a date and then in the proximity you find and you identify there is a credit card, then you can safely kind of with a lot of confidence can say that that date could be the date of expiry, or the date of initiation of the card, right? Similarly, if you find a date beside the passport number, then you can possibly look at whether that is the date of issue or date of expiry.
Issue or expired.
Yeah,
Right.
but if you just find a date beside a random ID, which does not get
It's
classified as
difficult
either as
to
a passport
classify.
or any other credit card or any other sensitive data, then you don't consider it as sensitive, right? It can be any date. It can be a date of a particular order, date of an invoice, where standalone it does not gives you any sensitivity or the data is not at risk. But if you see that data in proximity to a credit card or a passport number or something which is related to the personal date of birth of the customer, then you would mark it as a sensitive record. So these are the ways we enhance our classification techniques. But at the end, these are all automated ways. We have to still
Correct.
bring in a human in the loop. And we have a capability in our Optify solution where whatever the solution is classifying, a reviewer in the form of a business head or a data owner who is responsible for that particular data set would come and check and reclassify the data and ask us to baseline it. So they can override Optify's default classification and bring their own business rule and business knowledge, customize that, and refine it further. And once that is baselined, our system will learn from that interaction and
Hmm.
we would remove the false positive by 100%. Right.
Very
So it is a combination of a classical technique, a AIML technique, and bringing a human in the loop
human
through which
intervention, I
we
think.
reduce the false positive to a large extent.
Yeah. So seriously, thank you so much, Harsh and Ashish. I think, throughout today's discussion, we have established very important point that data discovery and classification is no longer just a compliance exercise or a security initiative or just a IT project. So it has now become business requirement that impacts the privacy, security, compliance, governance, risk management, or even emerging technologies like the Gen AI. So, which brings us to our final and perhaps the most, practical question of the day. So, Ashish, this is for you. So, for organizations that are just beginning their journey, what is the first step they should take to start their data discovery and classification program? And
Yeah.
how they can ensure that this initiative has a minimal impact on their day-to-day business operations. So, over to you,
Correct.
Ashish.
Yeah. So, I mean, data discovery and classification is obviously the foundation piece, but I think there is a mandate from the DPDP Act itself
Hmm.
that any organization who, whatever scale, whatever business they are in, they would have to do a assessment where they stand in the privacy implementation, right? So they would have to do a data privacy impact assessment, and that will help them understand kitne pani mein hai. I mean, how
Ah,
deep or how shallow we are standing, and how complex thing that we have to go ahead and implement. Because
right.
that's what I was telling, that earlier data security was looked at from a holistic policy driven purpose. But now with DPDP coming in, it is just not a policy driven, but a very strategic business level at the level of the board, where
Yes.
the
Yes.
board is to be convinced that we are doing business in compliance with the DPDP, and in that compliance journey, are we at level -1, level 0, 1, 2, 3, 4? So what level of maturity we are? You remember in
Yeah.
the initial days when India started IT journey and IT boom started, any company who was given outsourced work to India from US was to be assessed
Hmm.
as CMM level, right? What level of software development maturity you are. So similar case, this DPIA will tell you, though there are no defined maturity levels, basically organizations who have to start a privacy assessment would need to figure out where and how the, the customer personal data is getting collected, in which IT
Correct.
systems, in which applications, in which storage they are
Hmm.
being captured. So they have to initiate some kind of a cross-functional workshop and take inputs. Then they will understand the different business processes that is being executed in their organization, and in which of those scenarios what kind of data and what kind of sensitive data and who in the stakeholders within the organization are accessing that. So they have to map the data flow along the entire data life cycle within the organization
Yes.
and outside the organization, right?
Yeah.
Then they will understand the different points of collection and whether in at those point of collection there is a consent and a notice getting collected,
Correct.
so that
Correct.
the customers agreement and alignment is there with respect to what data they are sharing. And then it is a journey through which they will carry this exercise across all their business functions, departments, their different units, and then summarize all of that into a set of very graded list of high, medium, low kind of risk,
Assessment.
privacy risk, which
Yeah.
will then give them a heat map to understand which are the highest risky areas, which are the highest risky business processes, the highest risky data stores, the highest risky set of users, and their third party ecosystem, and what kind of risk they have, and what kind of controls and remediation have to be enforced. So it will give a holistic gap assessment report. And based on the gap assessment report, the board and the executive team will possibly kickstart a privacy implementation, right? And the first step of the privacy implementation would also be implementing a data discovery and classification.
Yeah, that was really very descriptive and very, comprehensive. Thank you so much, Ashish. And thank you so much, Harsh, for sharing your valuable insights with us today. So before we close, I would just like to summarize some few takeaways from today's discussion. So first thing is that you cannot protect your data if you don't know where it exists. That is the first thing. You need to know where it is. The data discovery is the first step. It is towards the privacy, security, or regulatory compliance. Third is that DPDP compliance starts with understanding and locating personal data across the organization. Fourth is that data lineage and business process mapping. It helps organization to understand not just where the data resides, but why it exists and how it supports the business operation. Then fifth one is accurate classification is critical to reduce risk and making informed security decisions. As organizations adopt GenAI, data discovery and classification becomes essential guardrails for responsible AI usage. And the last one is that the best way to begin is through a phased and a risk-based approach focused on the organization's most critical and sensitive data. So this was it for today. On behalf of JISA Softech and CryptoBind, I would like to thank all our attendees for joining us today. And we hope today's session has provided practical insights that you can take back and apply with your own organizations. So if you like and want to learn more about CryptoBind data discovery and classification capabilities, so discuss with your organization requirements with our team, and we would be happy to connect with you. And thank you so much once again. So from here, I think I'm going to sign off now. And if any questions, questions are welcome. Anybody want to ask any specific question not understood? So please feel free to put your questions in the chat box. Can you see any question in the chat box? Ganesh, no? Okay, so if we do not have any questions right now, we are open to take questions even after the session on emails. So please feel free to put your questions on our email ID or even in the chat box later in this chat. So we'll be happy to answer your questions. So for now, I'm logging off and thank you so much. Stay secure, stay happy. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.